Lesson 19, the other amendments, Amendments 11 through 27. Let's take you through these amendments, just provide for you an overview of these amendments. The 11th Amendment relates to the jurisdiction of the federal courts. In other words, it states that it says that states are immune to be taken to a federal court of a lawsuit by any citizen or subject to any foreign state. So really we're talking about the jurisdiction of the federal courts in the 11th Amendment. We'll talk more about that when we get to our legal system, the 11th Amendment. 12th Amendment is very important. This has to do with the Electoral College voting process, that the electors will use separate ballots for electing the president and the vice president. Originally in our Constitution, the runner-up in the electoral voting would automatically be the vice president to the winner of the electoral voting, who would be the president. But this was when our country had no political parties, when our Constitution was written. However, once the political parties developed and candidates ran under a party, then it was quite awkward if the runner-up of one party in the electoral voting would be the vice president of the other party, president. And so to keep the vice president and the president in the same party in the executive branch, the 12th Amendment provided for separate ballots for president and then a separate voting for vice president. That would ensure that the president and the vice president would be from the same political party. 12th Amendment. That was around 1800 when that amendment was added to our Constitution. 13th Amendment, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we call these the Civil War Amendments or the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment did away with involuntary servitude or slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So this was the amendment that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment may be the most important amendment to our Constitution. This defined a citizen as a native-born or naturalized American, and it said that no state could deny its citizens of due process or equal protection under the law. This amendment nationalized the Bill of Rights, making the Bill of Rights apply to the state governments as well as to the federal government. And many of our landmark Supreme Court cases are 14th Amendment cases. The constitutional issue involved is either over due process or equal protection. We're going to study the rest of those landmark cases in our course, and we will see that most of them are 14th Amendment cases. Due process, equal protection. 15th Amendment, this was the amendment that did away with prohibitions against African Americans. This allowed African American males, in this case, the right to vote, suffrage, the right to vote, cannot deny suffrage on account of race or previous condition of servitude. So a pretty short amendment, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's the 15th Amendment, African American male suffrage. The 16th Amendment, the federal income tax. Prior to this amendment, the federal government used primarily tariffs and excise taxes as source of revenue. But the 16th Amendment gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes. The federal income tax, the 16th Amendment. This was early 1900s, 1913, as you can see. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators by popular vote. Previous to the 17th Amendment, 2 senators were appointed to Congress by each state legislature. With the 17th Amendment, though, it gave the citizens the right to select their senators by popular vote. And also, the governor may fill a vacancy of a senatorial position with a special election. So a governor may fill a vacancy until a special election may be held. This was the 17th Amendment. But the most important thing about this amendment was the direct election of senators by popular vote. The people can vote for senators now. Again, this is the early 1900s. I want to say 19 teens, somewhere in the 19 teens, this amendment was added and ratified by the states. 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. This was the amendment that made it illegal for the production, transportation, and sale of, quote, intoxicating liquors, though not the consumption or private possession of alcohol. Notice the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol, not the consumption or private possession of alcohol. Of course, it's hard to get it unless it's produced, transported, and sold. This was known as the Prohibition Amendment, late 1919, I think, somewhere around there, with the 18th Amendment. It will last around 13 years or so before it was repealed with the 21st Amendment. The 19th Amendment, maybe 1922, women's suffrage, 1920. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Very short amendment. This is the Women's Suffrage Amendment, giving women the right to vote in all elections. Previous to the 19th Amendment, some states had allowed women the right to vote in their state elections, but this made it sure that, or guaranteed that all women had the right to vote in all state and national elections. The 20th Amendment shortened the lame duck period for a new president and Congress after the election in November. Inauguration Day, which used to be in March, that's a 4-month, what we call lame duck period for the old Congress and the old president after the elections in November. Now a new Congress is sworn in January 3rd, and a president on January 20th. And the pictures you see on the screen are President Obama's first inauguration being sworn in by John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Mr. Roberts made a mistake in the oath of office on that day and had to come back to the White House the next day to give the oath again because it wasn't the precise or exact oath that Chief Justice Roberts gave to President Obama back in 2009, January 20th, Inauguration Day. 20th Amendment shortened the lame duck period from 4 months to 2. Make the transition shorter from a new Congress and a new president. 21st Amendment did repeal the 18th Amendment. It's the only amendment to repeal another or take back a previous amendment. Early 1930s. It's the only amendment ratified by ratifying state conventions. This was a provision in the Constitution on how to change the Constitution by state legislatures or by ratifying state conventions. I find this interesting because I think there's a lot of politics involved. Maybe state politicians did not want to vote for ending prohibition because of maybe pressure in their states from people who did not want alcohol to be legal. So they turned to ratifying state conventions to ratify this amendment. 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, allowing for the sale, production, transportation, sale of intoxicating liquors once again to be legal. 22nd Amendment. This was the amendment that limited by Constitution 2 terms for the president or 10 total years. Previous to the 22nd Amendment, which was in early 1950s, there were no constitutional provisions on how long a president could serve. George Washington, if you may remember, set the precedent by stepping down after 2 terms, and every president after Washington followed that precedent, not running for a 3rd term, until FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ran for a 3rd term in 1940. Obviously, difficult times in the world. World War II had broken out in Europe, and Roosevelt ran for a 3rd term and then was also elected for a 4th term. He did die in his first year in office of the 4th term, and his vice president, Harry Truman, took over. So notice it's 2 full terms or 10 total years. Truman served 3 years, filling out Roosevelt's term, was elected in 1948 on his own and had 4 years. But he could not run for a 2nd full term. That would have given him 11 total years in office. So he could not run again in 1952. 2 full terms or 10 total years in office, the 22nd Amendment. 23rd Amendment, early 1960s, gave Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. First time that they had in their nation's history that the District of Columbia had electoral votes. No more electors than the least populous state. The minimum amount of electors is 3 for a state, and so D.C. gets 3 electoral votes. 23rd Amendment. 24th Amendment was the poll tax and the doing away with the poll tax. This is paying a tax on voting. You do not have to pay a tax when you go vote. That's the 24th Amendment. Of course, poll taxes was one way that many states in the South were using to try to restrict minority voting in the South. And the poll tax was made illegal by our Constitution, the 24th Amendment in the 1960s. 25th Amendment, early 1960s as well, dealt with the succession of the president after the death, his death or incapacitation in office. It's a really long amendment that's technical in detail that explains the procedure how a vice president becomes president after the death or incapacitation of the president. You may have heard some people talk about the 25th Amendment now with respect to President Trump. Some people feel that he's not well. Some people, minority of people, I think, and they talk about the 25th Amendment solution, a way to remove a not well president from office. 25th Amendment, presidential succession. 26th Amendment, early 1970s, 18-year-old has the right to vote. It's a pretty short amendment. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. So this gives youth the right to vote. Youth vote, 18-year-old suffrage, 26th Amendment. The last amendment, 1992, if Congress is to vote itself a pay raise, it does not go into effect until after the next congressional election. So if you don't like the fact that your member of Congress voted to give him or herself a pay raise, then you can vote him out of office before it goes into effect. That's the 27th Amendment. Pay raises do not go into effect until after the next congressional election. So those are our 27 amendments, amendments 11 through 27.